Good evening, everyone. Good morning in Chicago.
Hello.
And it's Ocean Geographic Live again. And this evening, we have Dr. NEO Mei Lin in Singapore, Alex in Chicago, and me in Sydney, Australia. Yes, so we're going to talk about giant clam tonight. And I know not many people pay attention to clam because we pay attention to corals, to sharks, to clownfish, and clam is like a background to take pictures of gobies and maybe some shrimp.
That's
and
cute.
then you try to put a hand between them and see where they get caught, and they make a huge sound, and then you see where they can get your hand off quickly enough,
Yeah.
So here we have.
Good to hear your anecdotes.
Tell us more about clam. So Alex, go away. Alex, take it away.
Okay, take it away. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to do a little bit of a bio so everybody knows a bit about you, and then we'll get into your presentation. So, for anyone who doesn't know her, Mei Lin is a marine ecologist working at the St. John's Island National Marine Laboratory. She's graduated from NUS with a bachelor's in life sciences and a PhD in marine ecology. Through her research, she found her favorite marine animal, the giant clam. Mei Lin's passion to save the giant clams led to the genesis of 2 restocking programs in Singapore, with the aim to breed and raise young clams to put back onto reefs. Her big dream is to build up marine conservation awareness in Singapore and elsewhere through science communication. In recognition of her efforts, Mei Lin was a recipient of the Singapore Youth Award in 2019. In 2017, she was also selected as the only Singaporean TED Fellow for the class of 2017. When not doing research, she actively volunteers with Team Seagrass and Reef Friends to promote marine conservation and educate fellow volunteers. So thank you so much for joining us today. And
yes, thank you, second time
excited to learn more about the giant clam.
Yeah, we're all going to be happy as a clam after this.
Oh,
yeah, I'm definitely very excited. Thank you, Michael and Alex, for the invitation. I think it's always a pleasure and very exciting for me to just talk about clams in general, and really looking forward to the questions later. So let's begin with my presentation. So give me a few seconds to share my, I need the screen sharing permission.
Oh, Michael, do you need to?
Okay, hang on. Why is it disabled? How do I enable it again? I think it's oh dear.
I got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes, it works for me now.
Okay, good.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Me.
Yep.
All good, I think.
All good.
Okay.
All good.
That's nice.
Wow.
Cool.
Cool. All right. So I've titled my talk as The Forgotten Giant. So I think Michael really kickstarted the session as aptly as I wanted to. When we think about marine life, especially as divers or people who really love oceans, really the more iconic and charismatic animals that comes to mind are the clownfish, seahorse, dolphins, sharks, rays, sea turtles, and maybe even the sea snakes. So it's to some extent some of the animals that live on the sea bottom does not get as much attention, just like the giant clams themselves. And this is a really nice picture. Thank you, Michael, for sharing as well. So this was taken in Palau. Really nice. Yeah. Like I think it's also one of the very iconic shots where people really love being just behind or in front, depending on how you see the animal, and being taken with it. I would say that unfortunately, I still do not have a photo of myself like this. So one day I would love to have something like that.
I'll do it for you. I'll do it for you.
Yeah. Let me go to get diving. So what's really interesting about giant clams is that when we talk about it, and when people, especially divers, there seem to be a misconception about these gentle giants, and that is like, are they really man-eaters? And actually, it's an interesting sort of story. So they were once thought to be legendary man-eaters just because there was a story that described a man who had lost his legs while trying to retrieve a pearl from a giant clam. So this particular illustration that I got a very good friend of mine, Kenneth, to help me re-illustrate, demonstrates the point. So So actually the pearl is real, but the story, well, it really depends. So I decided to do a little bit of detective work, and I discovered the origins of the story. So this is the picture that inspired the illustration that we saw earlier. So it is called Diver Trapped by a Clam, but instead of the legs is the hand. And it's actually also drawn by somebody else. So if we draw back a little bit more, that also is a newspaper article, quite a formal one, published in 1924. The title is Giant Clams Trap Sea Divers in Grip of Shells. Although the picture itself is just a really nice giant clam in the shallow tidal reefs. And what's really interesting is that we trace back a little bit more. It actually came from, or the instructions or the advisory came from a 1970 US Navy diving manual. And in this particular appendix, where they share about the different marine lives as well as the potential threats that each marine life could have on their divers, this is what it says about giant clams. It's immediately the second line, killer clams. And then I think if you go down a little bit more, basically drownings have occurred from divers accidentally stepping into the open shells and becoming trapped, which is really interesting. And actually, after sort of researching a few other articles, we come to realize that this is not true. It's false evidence or false information. So to date, actually, no one has really died or really get trapped by the giant clam that cause a human life loss. Instead, it's I think most of the instances, and in fact myself and like what Michael was sharing earlier as well, I've also put my hands over them, trying to test my luck if I could get my fingers back as quickly as I can. But I do have an interesting sharing, which is by a professor of mine. I think he was quite unlucky. He did put his fingers too near to a clam, and the clam did refuse to let him go. So unfortunately, it wasn't a big one. It wasn't one of the big ones. It was a small clam. So I can imagine, because these small ones have really tight grip. So once your fingers are inside, and the harder you try to remove yourself, the harder they try to actually grip onto your fingers. Yeah. Just because the response is to try and close up and protect the soft body inside the shell. So very unfortunately, he did not lose his fingers, but very unfortunately, the clam had to be cut open in order to release his fingers. Yeah, but yeah, that was the closest I would say, but definitely not a mortality. But if all else really fails, this is a very interesting comic that I found. We can call Superman to come and use his laser eyes to help us get loose from a giant clam. I mean, it was hilarious when I found this, and it's specifically a clam, and it looks pretty much like it. So yeah, we always can fall back to calling Superman if we need help.
That's funny.
So going back to the real thing, what are they? So they are what we call bivalves, and so the term bivalves just mean two shells, and the typical bivalves that we're more familiar with are the ones that we eat: mussels, oysters, and cockles. Essentially, this is what they are, but they have some unique features that makes them different from a lot of other bivalves here. So firstly, as their name suggests, they are the world's largest living marine bivalves. So in the marine realm, they are the largest ones. And the size is credited to mainly one species, which is also called the true giant clam, Tridacna gigas. This species, I think the record that it holds right now is it grows up to about 1.5 meters long, and it can weigh over 250 kgs. So it's really impressive in terms of size and mass and volume as well. It's not a very big family. In fact, it's a small family of giants. I will share a bit more on the recent updates. There's currently 12 recognized species in 2 different genera, Hippopas and Tridacna. And they're actually very closely related to cockles. So previously they were thought to be really unique because of how it looks like and the different functions that it has. But after using molecular approaches and techniques, they actually found out that, they're actually a lot closely related to cockles. And to give you an example, in Singapore, the most popular known cockle species is the blood cockle, or sometimes we call sea hum. So it's a cockle species that is used in one of our very popular dish, char kway teow. Not sure if you might have heard, or Alex, or have tried it. It's quite an interesting dish. So anyway, to give you an idea of the scale, blood cockles are usually no bigger than the size of a palm, but we know that the giant clams are a lot bigger. Even the smallest species of giant clam, which is about 15 cm long, is still relatively much bigger than a lot of species of clams that we know. They are what I like to call solar-powered animals because they are very similar to corals. They also host the photosynthetic microalgae cells that allows them to actually photosynthesize during the daytime and be able to, so these cells basically make a lot more food for the animals themselves, so that they basically develop a symbiotic relationship where the nutrients that comes from the waste products of the host animal clam actually goes into the microalgae cells, allowing them to photosynthesize and then producing the relevant food for the animal itself. So they're literally part animal, part plant. So they're definitely not entirely plant, but the animal part of them actually still allows them to actually filter feed in the water column for plankton. So it actually, this basically the combination of these two feeding mechanisms have been said to have contributed to the size that they can attain. Unlike most of the other clams, which either rely on one or the other, or heavily on one mode of feeding versus the other, but giant clams really can efficiently use the photosynthesis process to actually supply almost 80 to 90% of its diet. So this also makes them fairly sensitive to environmental changes in the reef. So one example would be ocean warming and ocean acidification as well. So on the ocean warming end, because these photosynthetic microalgae are very sensitive to temperature as well. So during a coral bleaching event, at sometimes, or depending on the situation, some of giant clams can be bleached out as well. And on the ocean acidification front, because they build calcium carbonate shells, so the acidification of our oceans could potentially also affect the way the structure of the shell is being developed, or in fact actually cause the erosion of the shell to some extent. And they have very interesting reproductive strategy, not unusual for the groups of clams, but for the giant clam itself, I think it's quite fascinating because when you look at them, you can't really tell whether they are male or female, or to some extent, what are the telltale signs of whether they are one sex or the other. But in fact, we don't have to be too confused about it because they're both. But how are they both at the same time? So only when they're at full maturity, which is usually typically 7 years and above, they are basically both of the male and female sexual organs would be present in the body, allowing them to basically play the role of a male or female during a reproductive event. But actually, when they are a lot younger, which is usually between the age of 2 and just before 7, they would remain mainly male because the organs for the female is not well developed yet. So they mostly can be, usually if they do participate in a spawning event, they would usually be contributing the sperm. And so this basically means that they are broadcast spawning animals, which means that they would release the eggs and sperm into the external water column. And in the water column, the eggs and sperm somehow have to find each other and fertilize. And this is quite problematic as well because it is sort of the secondary reason why the recovery of the natural populations of giant clam is challenged. Because the population numbers, it needs to be at a certain threshold or number and density that allows them to actually be able to, basically the eggs and sperm allow them to meet each other in the water column and cross-fertilize successfully in order to produce the next generation of baby clams. But if the number of clams on the reefs are too few, this process cannot be achieved. So it results in no new recruitment of baby clams on reefs. And this is what we're seeing in a couple of different places, particularly in Singapore, where I do most of my research in. So I think one of the common questions I always get about the giant clam is, how do I tell them apart? And I'll be very honest with you, it took me quite a while to really get used to some of the features, as well as coping with the new species that's constantly coming in the last couple of years. So, but very broadly, how do you tell them apart from at least the other clams on reefs is really the size. The size is really very, it's a distinct, it's an unmistakable feature, because even the smaller species, as I mentioned earlier, is still 15 cm long. And of course, anything that's beyond that is definitely a giant clam so far. So they also have this really colorful, vibrant pattern mantles. So firstly is the enlarged size. It's unusually larger than many other clam species, and that's also a unique evolutionary trait of this particular group of clams. So basically, this trait has so we're not sure which one comes first, which one came first, whether the relationship with the symbiotic algae came first, or whether is it the enlargement of the tissues of the mantles came first that allows them to photosynthesize and make the food. So basically, we don't know which factor is really driving that trait to be more distinct over the years. But regardless what has resulted out from that trait is that it has allowed them to be a very efficient light capture machine that allows them to eventually make a lot more food via the photosynthetic microalgae. And the colorful patterns are really quite unique on its own. And in fact, some people or some have suggested that they are like fingerprints, very unique across different individuals. Although I would say personally, in terms of the patterns, I still do see common patterns across them, but I'm not really analyzed them in detail to really tell if they truly are very unique to only individuals. And very broadly and very briefly about the Hippopus and Tridacna. So these are the two different genera of giant clams. So in this picture, in these pictures that you see here, the top picture is a Hippopus species, and the bottom picture is of a Tridacna species. So one feature that is obvious from the pictures here is that enlarged outer mantle for Hippopus is not extended outside of its shell. It's really just on the margins versus the one that you see at the bottom end of Tridacna. Of course, in the field, when I'm sure you have experienced it before, when you approach the animal, there's always a tendency for them to close up or retract their mantles very quickly. But I would assure that this is the natural state of how the animals look like. So, and it's true that it is a diagnostic feature that we tell them apart between Hippopus and Tridacna. So we'll see a little bit more of the different pictures and the different species that comes up in the next slide. And I'm very excited about this slide because I would say that it's my first time sharing all 12 different species of giant clams that have been properly recognized and based on science and based on the taxonomic expert as well. So a little bit of a history about this. So as far back as, well, maybe not that far back, but about 55 years back, in 1965, Joseph Rosewater, who is one of the taxonomic experts, he basically described the first 6 species that we see in the orange box. And these are the species that we're fairly familiar and they have very unique features that we can easily tell them apart by looking at pictures or when we see them in the field. But over the next few decades, another 6 species came up basically. So this list has exactly doubled this year. With the latest species to join the ranks is called Tridacna elongatissima, which is the one with the 2020 label. It's a gorgeous looking clam as well. But it's only found in the Western Indian Ocean. So it's really interesting because the recent species that have been discovered, about half of them are from the Western Indian Ocean and Red Sea regions. I would say personally, I've not known many recreational divers diving around that area. So images and photographs of these animals are hard to get. And during one of the work that I was doing, it was also still very confusing because when many people capture pictures of them, sometimes they don't capture the necessary features that allows us to distinguish them. But actually, if we have an opportunity to really look at these pictures much more closely, it's very easy to get them confused, or like you would think that one species is actually like one of the more common ones. So a lot of the recent identifications were heavily dependent on the genetic markers. So basically scientists started to merge the two tools together, morphology and genetic markers, to really confirm identities of species in the field. So yeah, this is, I think, and I think just to very quickly make a point for this species, that you only see the shells. That's also because that it's been recently rediscovered in the Western Indian Ocean.
Wow.
But interestingly, no one has had a good photo of the live specimen. And according to my colleague, she actually described it as a very rare endemic species of the Western Indian Ocean. So hopefully somebody will discover it and someone can actually verify that the photograph is indeed this particular species.
When you say Western Indian Ocean, which part of the Western Indian Ocean is that?
I think it's quite broad, the range. It includes not just the islands of like Mauritius, Reunion, Madagascar, as well as Mozambique, but the study also took the researchers outside on the outlying territories of these countries as well. So pretty much definitely along the coast of Africa, East Africa, if hopefully I got my geography right. But it's mainly along that stretch of continent. Yeah, it's a fascinating place for sure. It's interesting that a lot of the more recent species are all found from there. But I think mainly it's also because very little attention was given to that region. So it's really nice to know that there are still rediscoveries and new species from that area. So giant clams have been very useful to humans for many years. I guess like it goes back to tens and thousands of years as well. This is really a collage showing the different uses of the giant clam, from the meat to shells. So some of the more interesting one, and maybe some of us might not be aware, is that the one, for instance, the picture that I labeled as China, it's the typical high official hat being worn during some of the different dynasties. So I think fondly I remember watching a lot of these shows when I was younger on TV, and it really never occurred to me like how the ornaments were made and where the ornaments came from, and it was just like surprising for me to realize that actually that white mantelpiece on the hat, it actually came from the shell of a tridacna. And imagine that they already know of the animal at that time point, and being able to like exploit it in that way to use it as decorations and ornaments even at that time. And even in certain archaeological sites and excavation, they are constantly also digging up giant clam shells that have already been modified. So for instance, like the one that is shown here from Egypt, it's entirely carved, but you can still see the overall shape of the original shell. But it's really very nicely decorated already, and it's actually used as an official item for religious ceremonies, and many of such examples as well. What's also interesting is that it gives us an idea of where giant clams could be potentially found the last time. So before we know about the giant clams in the Red Sea, for example, this is basically our first evidence that the animal potentially were found along the coast of Egypt, and therefore being able to be used as an ornament for the societies and civilizations then as well. And going sort of towards our region as well, the Philippines and the Pacific, such as Guam, Papua New Guinea, Sabah, as well as slightly the limit or upper limit of the range of giant clams in Okinawa. You get to see the sort of the cultural differences, as well as how important is the animal in different societies as well. So this is really sort of a cultural part of the cultural history with respect to clams.
Really interesting.
So I think one of the things, yeah, definitely. So one of the things that motivated me to really continue my work at that time as an undergraduate, and also more of as I go along my research as well, I started to ask, like, why should I study them, and why should people care about them as well? And that basically got me on this journey of about a year or two, to really looking at the different aspects of the roles of different roles of giant clams on coral reefs. So when we talk about reefs and why they're important, we can easily come up with like tens and tens of reasons to justify the need for reefs and the benefits to us as well. So it's the same thing that I did in this particular exercise, looking at how giant clams are important to coral reefs, this one specifically. So under the umbrella term of ecosystem engineers, so I see them as sort of like little mechanical engineers in the ocean, being able to influence the environment to some extent. So for example, they are actually sources of food for reef animals. Not surprisingly, if they're food for us on land, I think they're also very delicious to a wide variety of different animals. Some of the interesting predators that I've seen on records include the triggerfish, the octopus, and to some extent the sea turtles. Apparently there has been one account where the sea turtle was seen chomping off the calcium carbonate shell, and that's quite interesting, because we are not sure whether there is it a form of picking up carbonate from reefs. And yeah, so because there are many different organisms on the reefs that requires carbonate as a building block for either their shells or outer structure. And whenever we see a clam, and exactly like what Michael was saying earlier, a really nice background for some of the really small organisms. And one of the studies that took us is basically counting the number of these small organisms living around the clams. Basically, we're trying to demonstrate how useful the clam in terms of the footprint in providing the additional surface area to accommodate even more organisms compared to the footprint that it's sitting on. So it's sort of like a relative comparison. A really long list of different animals, not just the fish, shrimps, crabs. Like I've seen flatworms just walking around, nudibranch using it as temporary shelters. Sometimes I actually see fish. I'm not sure what species, but fish laying their eggs on the surfaces as well. So it's really cool. To some extent, it's really like a condominium. So it's like, so basically the background that you see right here is sort of like a fun illustration of how I see the clams role on reefs. And finally, something broader and bigger, basically reef builders and shapers. Basically, if we just think of it in a simple scenario, a reef that is completely bare, nuded, completely flat, versus a reef that you have corals and you have clams. I think the stark difference between these two images that you can imagine right now is the dimension, the third dimension that is that you can imagine for the habitat with corals and clams versus one that's very flat. So basically we do know, and we've seen pictures, and we are aware that reefs that are very flat or reefs that have been destroyed and flattened, you don't get many diversity, you don't get much animal life to some extent. But in a reef and reefs with clams, it's very different. It's very vibrant. You can see life, like literally life coming alive in that sense. So that's really the role of being a reef builder and a reef shaper in this case. But sadly, they are really becoming endangered. And I think that's sort of the next the sort of the follow-up question that I had, which is, yes, now I know what are the different roles, and I can better justify to some extent why people should care about them and why we should all pay a bit more attention to them on the reefs as well. But I think the next step for me is to also find out how endangered are they. And basically, this took me on a 2-year journey to looking at this particular massive review for the paper. And I'm really very thankful to all the different co-authors who came on board as well. So I started this review by looking at over more than 1,000 different papers, reports, grey literature, and I even actually started to trawl through Flickr, the photo page. It ended up being such a useful resource because everyone who was using Flickr put up their pictures, and they actually labeled them at least with the term giant clam. It made it a lot easier for me to filter. I think I went through almost 20 or 30,000 pictures just to, the idea was to really get a really good sense of where they are found in the world. So we know that the region is Indo-Pacific, but we don't really know where in the Indo-Pacific. So we're more familiar with maybe Southeast Asia, but we're not so familiar with the other parts such as the Red Sea and East Africa, for instance. So that exercise was really helpful because it really helped me to pull out the rarer information from regions that are very less known. So from here, I think the main outcome is that almost a quarter of the locations or the localities that I've surveyed reported at least one species locally extinct. And the term locally extinct means that the species, you can either no longer find a species in that region, or there are too few to actually be viable for reproduction. So what are the factors? I think some of us are also curious and interested. So very closely linked to some of the human activities or very closely linked to some of the human users. But what has happened is that it's not just the sustainable use of it, but it's really basically the overexploitation, over-harvesting. So basically, as a form of seafood, using the shells in the trade as carvings, and not forgetting the bigger problems such as climate change. And this picture here basically is just 2 months ago in Queensland, Magnetic Island. The giant clams that were found along the trail were already bleaching in this case from the recent warming event. And I think what's really nice about the highlights of the threats and challenges is that there happened to be this recent paper that I would like to very quickly share. I was very surprised when I saw the poster because giant clam was actually one of the top 5 based on the analysis of this study. So this study basically looked at a variety of different marine megafauna, and I think the definition of marine megafauna in this case is more than 45 kgs. So I think the clams definitely fulfilled that criteria. But I was really surprised, but at the same time worrying as well, because the trends, or at least what the paper is suggesting, is that if we do nothing or we do very little, this species will go extinct in the next 100 years. So it is of a certain conservation priority, not just for the work I do, but hopefully for anyone who's also working on them or even looking after them. So just gonna very quickly share some of the different things that I've done over the years. So people always say, like sometimes when you're in the field of marine conservation, it can get really dark, like sort of gloomy, because of and a lot of pessimism, because of like how the bigger issues are playing out, and you're actually seeing like the effects of human activities on reefs and on the oceans as well. But I like to actually show a little bit more of the positive side. So it may not be on a very big scale, because a lot of the work that I do is mainly still focused in Singapore, but definitely still hoping to try and expand it out. So I like to show you that it is a mission possible to save the clams. So one of the first few work that I did and started as an undergraduate student is to culture them in the lab. And that involved definitely going out to the field, collecting some of the mature giant clams that basically can produce the eggs that we need for breeding the giant clams. So these are some of the pictures that really shows the background work that is done. So very quickly over, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. So
Yeah.
in this picture,
Yes, you can see it. Yes.
Yeah, so the one that I was looking, so I'm basically not really sure what I'm looking at as well, because let me explain. Over here is a cloud of sperm water, and it's definitely almost impossible for me to spot the sperm in this case. But I think it was just like sort of a gesture to make sure that it's cloudy. And we also wanted to make sure that the spawning had not included the eggs. So a bit more about the spawning event is that usually sperm would spawn first, followed by eggs. So we need to actually really continuously monitor the what is being ejected out, and make sure that we would clear the water and collect the eggs in freshly collected seawater in this case. So this is really how the clam looks like when it actually like explodes in that sense. If it's completely underwater, some people would say they look like smoking. I think there was a picture earlier that I showed that they kind of look like they're smoking. So that's also some sort of a telltale sign of like they are actually reproductively ready. This is how a baby giant clam looked like at like 10 days old. What was really interesting for us is this particular foot. So it's, I guess, like it's not a common perception to think that animals like them or animals like this small can actually move, or how do they actually move. So we know that they can swim, they have the right swimming appendages, but being able to walk on the seafloor, I think that was still a bit mind-blowing. So that was also some of the work that we did in the laboratory. If you're actually interested, or if anyone's interested, you can actually catch my TED Talk. I have included a walking behavior video in that talk, and explain a little bit of the background with the experiment as well. So second part of it is, after I have all my larvae, I have all the little giant clams, what am I going to do with them? So one of the first things and one of the strengths of my lab with my PhD supervisor is to run experiments. We love designing and building different experimental setups to really test some of the different parameters or factors on either behavior, or even more recently, a lot more for me personally, more interest in how the different environmental changes and environmental factors such as temperature, pH, with respect to ocean acidification affects them at this life stage. So given that we can safely, or I think the hypothesis is that the early life stages are more sensitive because of the entire structure, but also because they are really at their early life as well. So we're concerned that if ocean warming, ocean acidification, or even pollution would have a much stronger effect or impact on this group versus the adults. So these are the different sort of images of the different work I do. So not just confined the lab, but I really do love lab work as well, because it gives me the opportunity to be really creative with my setup. So you can see that I just like put rulers with clothes peg around, and that's how I measure the squirt. But the more sophisticated one is colleagues from National Parks Board was testing out their remote sense, like the arms here, which allows them to actually measure photosynthetic efficiency of the animal. So this is actually something long-term that they actually put it over the clam to actually do some measurements. And sometimes when people think of our work, they think that we use really sophisticated instruments or equipment. But sadly, not really. If you actually really sort of notice, like we use funnels, we use normal water hose, very typical plastic aquarium tanks. The 30 cm plastic ruler is really perfect. It's highly tolerant to the corrosive seawater, so that's perfect. Always bring them down when we are measuring anything. I think it's a bad habit right now because every time I do leisure diving, I mean, I would still have a ruler and a notebook with me just so that I can like record anything that is very interesting during the trip as well. So after that, so some of them, not all of them are part of the experiments. We actually grow them out for the reefs. So this is just some of the, also the behind the scenes of how it's done, or one of the ways of how it's done. So in Singapore, our water conditions are less than ideal. So you can sort of see that also from the pictures that I have here. Only the first picture, it looks clearer, but that's also because it's in the marine lab aquarium. So what we do is we actually build racks. We ensure that they are actually in safe places like the baskets that will allow us to actually go back on a regular basis to measure how much they've grown over time. We also give them a little bath. This is where I engage with some of my volunteer friends who very kindly comes out with us either during their work days or even on the weekends to come help us clean the clams, give them a little bit of a good scrub. So, and I think finally something that I kind of tie in with all of the different research aspects of my work is really science communication. I think at a very early stage of my work, the first part of the thing is that who would care about my work? I publish them in in scientific journals, and journals are behind paywalls. And it just got me thinking that if these are all behind paywalls, who's going to read them? And the other perspective is, apart from scientists, who else can really understand my work? So that got me started to started science writing and really translating some of the work that I do, some of the work that my colleagues do right now, and just write them in a way that everyone can understand. And also, not just that, but find something that's interesting that would also be captured in their, say, memory as well. So whenever they see a clam, or whenever they go out diving, or whenever they think of the research work that we do, this will come to their mind very quickly. And just generally a few points of why I feel that engaging public is important. I think it helps to get people on board. So a huge aspect of my work and a huge chunk of the data that I get is really because my citizen scientist friends, volunteers who go out to the field, whenever they see a clam, they would tag me on Facebook, and it's really interesting because people on Facebook usually tag people with faces, but they tag me with a clam instead, which is perfectly fine, I guess. But I mean,
sort of looks like a face, I guess.
Yeah, you can. There's the two eyes, sort of, one big, one small. But I mean, it's a way for me to collect data, and I've been basically collecting data for over 10 years now in that way, with really the big, massive help from different people who are so willing to share the information that they have. As I mentioned earlier, making the information accessible to a wide range of different audience. I think it also helps to increase the literacy of the different topics. So in my case, marine conservation and ocean issues, and definitely, as I mentioned earlier, crowdsourcing for information and ideas. It's really the best way. The people actually have a lot more information that sometimes scientists don't have access to. I think very quickly to wrap up my presentation, has my mission been successful? Or that could be a question that I get as well of what do I see myself in and how do I see my work coming along? I think it's a resounding yes for me. It may be in a different form. It may not be in a way where I repopulated the entire Singapore with clams. I mean, if I did that, I think some people would have also questioned me, like, why are there so many clams on the reefs? So there's no good balance, right? Like too many, too little. But anyway, I think it's definitely the early part of my research work has helped given me the necessary credentials to further my my cause in championing for them. That I mean, it shows people that I'm serious, and my work is strongly based on science and a lot more now on marine policy with the help of some of my colleagues. And in this journey as well, I think there has been a lot of mentor figures that has helped to inspire and encourage me. I think in one particular person that I would like to mention especially is the late Professor Edgardo Gomez from the University of Philippines. He has done so much in the last 40 years of his career. And even the last time that we met, he was still telling me and encouraging me to just go forth and do what I want to do and do what I can for the giant clams. So in some sense, I think it's also to not just for my personal cause, but I think it's to kind of help to carry on that legacy as well. In terms of network as well, and the people that I meet, the people that I've converted to some extent, maybe some of them I might be listening right here, to become a giant clam person, which I'm actually very happy because I mean, when I started, I was pretty much on my own. I don't really know a lot of people working on clams. So over the last few years has been really pleasant and really nice as well, because there's a lot more in sharing, there's a lot more willingness to expand the network of understanding what's going on. And personally myself, I don't abuse the information given to me. Instead, I encourage them to share. I encourage them to also let me share if possible or where possible as well. And I guess like as a science communicator, I've given a voice to the voiceless giant clams. And hopefully giving them an age to survive in the decades to come as well. I think more importantly, raising awareness about the clams so far is also getting people to see the bigger picture, the ongoing impacts on the coral reefs around the world. And this fight for the clams and the oceans is an endurance race. This mission is not over, and I'm not sure when it will be over. We just have to keep going and get things done as far as we can. So with that, thank you very much. And yeah, if anyone has any other questions, they'd like to get in touch with me, this is my hotline. And just very quickly to share the different organizations that, particularly a lot of them based in Singapore, who have given me the help, as well as many other institutions and colleagues in Singapore and abroad. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Michael, you have anything
Yes,
off the top of your head?
I know, I always have questions.
I know, I was like, all right.
I think you exude so much passion in your talks and when you refer to all these clams. But of all the 12 species you mentioned, are any one of them listed in IUCN endangered as an endangered species at all?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned about the IUCN red list. It's also one of my to-do lists, which has been on the back burner for a while. But basically of the 12 different species, and because this list is constantly evolving, when the list was first started, only 9 of the species were listed officially on IUCN red list with a status that is about 20 over years old. Like really old in both ways, 20 years old and it's old. So that prompted me to also get in touch with the specialist group to figure out to find out how I can contribute, especially with the review paper that I mentioned earlier. That would really help with the baseline information of helping to assess the status of each of the species. So what's tricky about it is that the more recent species, many of them would probably fall into the category of data deficient under the IUCN criteria, which is not very helpful, but at the same time, not a bad thing, because I think at the very least, they are recognized. That's one. which basically means that it hopefully prompts the need to actually do more surveys to understand the statuses of the more recent 6 species, as well as people to get people to actually focus on them. I mean, particularly like the one that I mentioned, the only picture we have is the shell, like whether there are still, we're very sure the live ones are there, but we just don't know how many of them, and apparently they are said to actually be frequently collected by the local fishermen around there. So it is a bit worrying because I mean, very broadly, I think when people go fishing for them, they indiscriminate. They're not gonna be very concerned about the species. They are more concerned about the size. So especially with a lot of the recent species being a lot difficult to identify in the field, it's possible that they are already over collecting one over the other, or vice versa as well.
So in terms of the endangered species, are there any form of protection from collections? Are there any laws or rules in terms of, if we see them being collected in the Philippines, in South China Sea, in Indonesia, is there any, I mean, is there any kind of protection afforded them at all?
Yeah, I think we can look at protection in sort of 2 different categories. So one is the international protection, and that would fall under the CITES, which is Convention for International Trade of the Endangered Species. So for that, I think it's pretty well managed from what I've seen on the database, as well as what I currently understand of the trade, is that it's mainly for aquarium trade. So what I understand is that for most of the aquarium trade, it's mainly the cultured animals. So very little from the wild, but mainly from farms. So that, but then again, we know that to some extent there probably is harvesting from the wild. But the management of CITES is on international borders. It's basically country to country. It has to basically, the animal has to cross a boundary before the CITES is enforced. And that's very effective because animals that come through borders and they don't have paperwork, they'll immediately be known to be illegally imported, exported, regardless of their status, whether they're wild or cultured or farmed. But the problem that we have is that the local laws. So it's like, for instance, you talk about Philippines. Philippines is actually one of the few countries that have very strict laws about the protection of giant clams. In fact, all species, regardless of the species name, all of them are protected under the Fisheries Law and Fisheries Act. But the problem that they have, and in most places as well, is enforcement.
Right.
So laws and legislations are all written in words. Yes. Yeah. So it's always about the challenge has always been about enforcement. And I guess like very big countries, say for instance like Philippines, where they have different provinces and small towns and villages, they all manage their resources very differently as well. So one town from the other, one of them might be a lot more protective of their giant clams versus another one next door who's not, but they're next door and possibly having some kind of crossing. So yeah, there'll always be some examples like this. I think not just the Philippines, I think in places where there are very, very distinct sections of their villages and provinces.
And giant clams, I'm referring to Tridacna gigas, are they sociable? Are they territorial? Because we always find them in Buna, for example, in Bunakan, we find 3-4 of the big one together. In Rajamba, exactly the same, you know. And then they really come together, and then once in a while, 1 or 2 would disappear.
Okay, I don't know about the disappearance part, but I could probably share a little bit about the this social behavior that you mentioned. So to some extent, they are sociable with each other. Maybe not, I'm not sure about with humans. But basically that's the study that I shared earlier about them, the walking behavior. So that was the fascinating part. We basically laid them in grids. So we know that we spaced them out equally, but after 24 hours, we see a whole bunch of them just clumping and sticking together in the center. So we were really very curious. Why would they do that? Why would they choose to go to each other and stick to each other as well? So there are some reasons. So one of it could be for reproduction. So earlier on we talked about the spawning strategy. So being close together potentially helps them to gather the eggs and sperms more easily compared to when they are very spaced out. The other is just predator. It's almost like a herding effect, or at least the analogy for terrestrial species. So and if we imagine the one that we eventually see, the very large ones, and we only see 1, 2, or 3, or maybe even in isolation in most instances, it could be that when they were growing up, they had a lot more around them. But over time, when they grow bigger, it could be competition, it could be predation, it could be for many different reasons. They actually walk away also. They end up being just in very small numbers or even isolation. I think Tridacna gigas is a little bit problematic right now. A lot of the individuals we see, I think in Raja Ampat is, what I understand from Raja Ampat is maybe it's not so bad. But in places like, say, in the Pacific Ocean islands, in some places they only find one individual after tens of dives. So we can tell that it is definitely the highly threatened species compared to the other species in the family.
Yep.
Alex, may I check on those questions?
Yeah. So one of our questions from Facebook is, does Singapore's highly sedimented water actually benefit the giant clams since they're filter feeders?
Oh, that's interesting. There was a study that attempted to figure out if the highly sedimented and nutritious water helped. I think it's only to a small extent. So because one of the features of this animal is that even though they can filter feed, but filter feeding is actually only a very small proportion of where they take up their food. So most of it still comes from the photosynthetic microalgae. So in a way, actually having excess nutrients in the water does not necessarily help the animal to grow faster and better. And that's what we're also seeing. The animals are not necessarily a lot bigger and faster, especially when we start growing them from such a small size. It's always about the amount of sunlight and the water temperature in the aquarium systems that benefits the animal's growth.
Wow.
Neat. Okay, I have a lot of questions. So I'll try to be reasonable. Okay, so while we're on the topic of them being photosynthetic, are the zooxanthellae species that colonize clam tissues the same species that live in corals, or are they different?
I think there are overlaps in terms of some of the species between corals and clams. But what I've also recently, a recent work that my student did was that she also found that there are unique species of zooxanthellae that's only found in giant clam species. So
interesting.
And yeah, just some slight differences, but definitely quite a bit of overlaps.
Okay.
But I think just very quickly to add on is that while we know that there are common species between corals and clams, but the responses to bleaching is very different. And that's also because of the way, not really the way, where the zooxanthellae is found in corals versus in clams. So there's an added layer of protection to the zooxanthellae in the giant clams versus corals. So that's why I think we always, and at least that's my personal opinion, I've always seen corals bleach first before any of the clams do.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I also didn't realize that so much of their food source came from them. I thought more of it would have been filter feeding, but that's so surprising.
Yeah.
So let me see, what else do I want to know? Oh, so when we go diving, so often you see these clams and they're embedded in the rocks. They just look like they're sandwiched in the rocks with no space, but obviously they have to have growing room. So how does that work? How do they both live in the rock and grow?
So that's a very unique species. And I think for the origin of the idea of so as much as I'm using the word boring, but they're not boring, but it's just more of the behavior itself as well. So they bore into these holes, and for the longest time, people have been trying to figure out whether they mechanically and physically use their bodies to like bore, or whether is it acid,
chemical. Yeah.
Yes. So actually, just 2 years back, there was a study that confirmed that it's actually acid.
Oh, that's
creates
neat.
the burrow. Yeah. So as it grows, the tissue that secretes the acid grows as well. And as it grows, basically, it would just slowly dissolve the carbonate structure around it.
Wow.
It's very fascinating because the way they have to bore is they have to bore the entire volume. They're not just boring the bottom.
Yeah.
So it's just the first. I think it's just the first confirmed evidence that it's acid. But I'm sure to some extent there's mechanical. Like I'm sure they do this.
Probably both. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be very cool if we can see them do that dance. But we haven't seen that yet. No.
The best gift ever. A clam doing this.
Yeah.
I like it. That's really interesting though. Very cool. So you showed that picture of the clam larvae. So obviously at some point when the egg and sperm first get released, they're a mobile larvae. At what point do they settle out onto the reef?
Pretty quickly, actually. Like most of the different invertebrate species, their not life cycle, sorry. The cycle before settlement is about 2 weeks. So by the second week, they would lose a little. I think they would mostly lose the swimming appendages. So they will become heavier and they sink to the bottom, and that's when they start to walk around the surface.
Interesting. That's so cool. All right, what else do I have? Oh, have you ever collected gametes live out in the ocean, or do you always do that in the lab?
So for me, for my work, I've always done it in the lab, so it's a lot more controlled. But I have
it must be so hard.
But I have colleagues who have done it in the wild or in the open ocean. But that's also because they work on Tridacna geigers, which are really heavy to carry back to the lab.
Yes.
So like, I think they have to like weigh out the balance, like the pros and cons. So I guess they basically they would arrange the animals in a circle. They would induce them to spawn by injecting serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter. And then that would basically cause them to contract and release and expel the eggs and sperm. And basically they would just literally, it's a plastic bag over them. And then just close and bring it up to the boat.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so neat. I was always wondering that. I thought, do people just go to the same site every single day and wait? I thought, wow, that must take forever.
Yeah. I think natural spawning is pretty rare. I mean, until now, I think there's only been a handful of records. Australia is I think Australia has one really old set of data from 85, 86. That's when they actually naturally spawn. And they were basically trying to measure the distance between the animals, so that they were trying to find what's the nearest possible distance or the furthest possible distance that you should arrange the animal before fertilization is not possible.
Wow.
And it differs from reef to reef anyway. But that was a very neat study because they had enough animals naturally in that setting to examine or to investigate.
Yeah. Okay, one last question, and then I'll leave you alone.
I
want one more. Quiet. So I'm curious about this. So I'm in the U.S. and 8,500 million years ago, this was an inland sea. And in the American Southwest, we have fossils of gigantic clams, like at least this size, if not bigger. Would this potentially be a similar species to what we now see in the Indo-Pacific? Or was it, I don't know, I'm just wondering how possible it is that it's similar.
Yeah, I recall reading an article about this as well, that there could be even larger clams than what we do see today as well, especially in the fossilized state.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if I guess like science will progress at one point where it'll be able to allow us to actually do either DNA comparison or maybe even scanning of the shells, being able to see whether the features are more similar or actually different. But I think there are already studies suggesting that they could be ancestors, but they are definitely under a different set of families at the moment. Like, I mean, the naming system.
Of course. All right, neat. Okay, Michael, go ahead.
How long did it live for, giant live for in the wild? I mean, how many years?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, like the only way to actually, so the only way to best estimate the age is basically having to cut the shells in half. Basically, they have growth rings. They have daily growth rings, they have weekly and monthly and etc. So we'll be able to actually figure out how old they are, but that would require sacrificing the animal if it's alive. If it's a dead one, which is quite a lot of number of studies doing that right now, they will also be able to give an estimate as well. I think the best guess, or at least is at least of 50 or 60 years. I'm pretty sure of that.
Wow.
Yeah. Like even, yeah, I think for instance, like there was one individual, we call her Mama Jong. We basically named her after the island that we found her. And in fact, she's very special to me because she's the first wild giant clam that I saw as a young student. And we basically, as a group of volunteers, passionately monitored her over the last 10 years before she died. I think very sadly, because I think it was just happened to be the turn of a bleaching event. So we're not sure whether she was impacted, because we only get to go to we get to visit her once a year or twice a year. So we only know whether she's there and how she's doing every year. So happened that year, I couldn't go out, but my colleague Ria, she went out and she was greeted by a sad sight. So, but it was impressive because we actually monitored her for over 10 years, and she was already fairly old looking by that time. So if I just do a little bit of a add and math, she's potentially a 30 or 40-year-old, because the site itself, the site that we found her, it's fairly untouched, not as impacted by some of the developments around the islands here in Singapore. So we basically gave a good estimate. And also based on some of the animals that we are growing right now, we could more or less give a sort of a guesstimate of what could their age be.
There's a question asked by a friend of ours: can we move giant clam to another safe place at the same depth? Because there's basically to protect them, moving them to a safer place.
Yeah, I think it's a technique. I would say it's a technique that a lot of people in different parts of the coast use in order to protect their stocks. I've received these questions before on the feasibility, if it's possible to translocate them from one place to another. The answer is yes, but I think it's really with caution and also understanding whether the environments are fairly similar or actually very different, and what are the necessary changes that you need to make to, say, the new site in order to accommodate them. So for example, most of the requests that I've heard of are basically the animal used to be in an offshore island or somewhere further away from the coast. They want to bring it nearer to, say, mainland or closer to land for good reasons, because it's just a lot easier to monitor. It's just literally by the sea, right? But the conditions are really very different, like say the water flow, and also the closer you are to coast these days, it's really highly sedimented as well. So that itself could be a stress factor for the animal as well. So I'll say that it's usually has to be done with quite a bit, at least a bit of more consideration, whether the sites are equivalent. If not, what can you do to make the site better so that you can accommodate the survivability of the animal after translocation.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
That was great.
Very interesting. Let's go and move giant clams. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I know it's late, and we really appreciate it.
No, for sure.
Really appreciate it. And Thank
Thank
you
you.
This has
everyone
been
for
great.
watching. In a couple of weeks' time, I hope maybe you have a colleague of yours, a friend of ours in the United States who study electric clam.
Ooh,
Will be on with us, so you may want to watch that.
yay. Yeah, that's cool.
Clam
Electric clams
party.
are also, yes. Oh, that one's really a party clam.
Yeah.
It's a party clam. She sort
That
of
is-
nicknamed it the disco clam.
Oh,
That's pretty cute.
yeah. That's awesome.
I like it.
All right, thank you so much, and
Cool.
take care.
Thank you,
and
everyone.
see you soon in Singapore, of course.
Yep.
Good night.
Stay
Have
safe.
a good night.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching.